Slavery was abolished over 1,500 years ago, right? So why is the debate over reparations for it front and center today? It's a huge, complicated question, and in this explainer, we're going to unpack it all. The history, the arguments for and against, and the real-world challenges behind this call for repair.
So to really get into this, we first have to wrap our heads around what we're even talking about when we say slavery. The sociologist Orlando Patterson had this really powerful definition. He called it social death. And that's key. We're not just talking about forced labor here. This was a system specifically designed to strip away everything that makes a person human, their history, their family, their very identity.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the system itself, this global machine. Then we'll look at what happened after emancipation. We'll trace its enduring legacy to today, lay out the actual case for reparations, and finally dive into why this is such a complex calculation.
Okay, let's jump in. First thing you've got to understand, American slavery wasn't some isolated regional thing. No, it was the literal engine of a global economic machine, a machine that in many ways built the modern world as we know it.
And that machine, it ran on that idea we just mentioned, social death. This was cold and calculated. People were given new names. They were forbidden from speaking their own languages. And families were just systematically ripped apart. Why? To break every single human connection and exert absolute control. They were even branded with hot irons, just like cattle, to permanently mark them as property.
And we're talking about an industrial scale here. Think of the Americas as basically being turned into massive factory farms. Take sugar. They called it white gold. The work was so brutal that the average life expectancy on a sugar plantation was just 7 to 10 years. Unbelievable. Or look at cotton. By 1860, the American South was supplying a staggering 80% of all the cotton for Britain's massive textile industry.
Now, it's also really important to understand that the supply chain here was complicated. The demand, of course, was coming from European and American plantation owners, but the supply often involved African kingdoms and traders who were capturing and selling other Africans into the trade. It was a truly global enterprise, and recognizing this complex web is absolutely key when we get to the modern debate.
So, 1865. The Civil War ends. Slavery is abolished. But that was not the end of the story. Not even close. In a lot of ways, it was just the start of a whole new chapter of control, just under a different name.
You see, the 13th Amendment, the one that abolished slavery, had this one tiny but incredibly important loophole built right into it. It says slavery is abolished except as a punishment for a crime. And that little clause, it was immediately weaponized.
Here's how it worked. Southern states passed these things called black codes. These were laws that made it a crime to do things like not have a job. They called it vagrancy. So newly freed black men were arrested in huge numbers for these minor infractions. And then the states would lease them out, literally rent them, as forced labor to private companies. They were put to work on railroads, in mines, on farms, in conditions that were just as horrific as slavery. It was slavery by another name, but this time it was perfectly legal.
And this just set off a kind of domino effect. The Black Codes eventually became the Jim Crow laws, enforcing decades of segregation. After that, you get things like redlining. This was a government-backed policy where banks would literally draw red lines on a map around black neighborhoods and refuse to give them mortgages or loans. This made it nearly impossible for generations of black families to build wealth through homeownership, which is the primary way most Americans do it, you see? Each new system was just built on the foundation of the last one, creating this compounding effect of economic exclusion.
Okay, so that's the history. But let's connect the dots to today. What are the actual measurable consequences of all this that we can still see right now, over 150 years later?
Well, the data is pretty stark. Just look at life expectancy. Even today, there's a nearly 5-year gap between black and white Americans. And people who support reparations say, look, that's not an accident. They argue it's a direct result of generations of stacked disadvantages, things like polluting industries being built in black neighborhoods, or a historic lack of access to good hospitals and healthy food. It all adds up.
So how do you explain why these gaps persist? Well, some scholars have put forward theories like post-traumatic slave syndrome. The basic idea is that the sheer, unimaginable trauma of slavery, followed by a century of systemic racism, didn't just disappear. It created a kind of multi-generational trauma that's been passed down, leading to ongoing psychological and behavioral effects that are still felt today.
And it's not just a few academics saying this. You have major institutions like the American Academy of Family Physicians drawing a direct line from slavery and practices like redlining straight to the wealth and health gaps we see right now. The whole point here is that this isn't about ancient history. The argument is that these are very real, ongoing problems with very deep historical roots.
Okay, so with all that history and context in mind, let's talk about the solution being proposed. What do people actually mean when they say reparations?
Because it's usually not just about writing a check. The United Nations, for example, has this whole framework for what true reparations look like. And yeah, it includes compensation for damages, but it's also about things like restitution, returning property. It includes rehabilitation, like providing healthcare or legal services. It includes satisfaction, which means things like public apologies or building memorials. And crucially, it includes guarantees to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again.
And supporters of this idea will tell you, hey, this is not some new radical concept in America. They point to the promise of 40 acres and a mule made to freed slaves right after the Civil War. Even though that promise was quickly broken, they point to over $100 million ordered to be paid to the Sioux Nation for stolen land. And they point to the payments made to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. The point is, there is a precedent for the U.S. government paying for past harm.
But, and this is a huge but, trying to apply that precedent to the legacy of slavery brings up some massive challenges, both practical and philosophical. And these challenges are really the core of the arguments against reparations.
And it really boils down to this almost impossible question. Who pays and who gets paid? How do you figure all of that out when the actual people who were enslaved and the people who enslaved them have been gone for generations?
Well, critics often bring up immigration. Take a look at this data. One analysis shows that a huge majority, 81% of European Americans, have ancestors who came to the U.S. after 1870, so after slavery was already abolished. So the question they ask is, why should my family, who arrived here from, say, Italy in 1920, have to pay for a crime they had absolutely nothing to do with? It really forces this tough conversation about who, if anyone, is responsible today.
Opponents also say you can't really compare this to something like the reparations for Japanese American internment. That situation was very different. First, it was a specific illegal act by the U.S. government against its own citizens. And second, and this is the big one, the actual victims were still alive. You could identify them and compensate them directly. With slavery, the victims and perpetrators are long gone, and trying to trace direct lineage for millions of people today is, well, it's a logistical nightmare, if not completely impossible.
So because of those challenges, a lot of modern proposals have shifted away from individual checks. Instead, you have groups like the American Academy of Family Physicians suggesting a more community-focused approach. They're talking about massive investments in things like tuition-free college, housing grants, or business startup funds, all specifically targeted at Black communities. The idea is to repair the systemic damage, not just pay individuals. On the other side, you have opponents, like folks at the Cato Institute, who say there's a much better way. Their argument is that instead of looking backward, we should focus on the future. Let's just vigorously enforce the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection for every single American, right now. They believe the focus should be on creating true equality of opportunity for everyone, through programs that help all disadvantaged people, rather than creating race-based programs that they feel would just divide the country even more.
And that really is the fundamental question at the very heart of this entire debate. How does a nation truly repair the deepest harms of its past? Do you do it by creating specific programs to address these specific legacies of history? Or do you do it by committing everything you have to a future where every single citizen is guaranteed equal protection under the law? There is no easy answer here.